Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we'll begin our journey into the story of the longest siege of the Second World War, and perhaps and arguably the deadliest siege of all time, the Siege of Leningrad. Hi Jesse, here we are again, another week, another podcast. This time we're moving back to the Eastern Front to look at, as I've just said, one of the most important episodes of the war, the biggest siege. Perhaps slight spoiler alert to all the listeners if you don't really know this. So this really is a big one. It's a fundamentally big one. If you look at the casualty figures, and we're going to discuss them in much more detail later on, but if you look at them, in the Siege of Leningrad, the Soviet Union loses more men, both civilian and military personnel, than the US, Britain, and the entire Dominions and the Commonwealth put together in the Second World War. So it really is a big one that we're talking about now. So let's do what we always do. And I keep saying, and I think in every single episode, before we zoom in and look at the detail, the tactical detail, and look at the operations on the ground, let's zoom out and let's have a look at the strategic, the political, the bigger picture context. And I think we need to talk a little bit about St. Petersburg itself. Why is St. Petersburg important? Why is it where it is? And all these things. So, Jesse, why don't you start us off?
Yes, and a big factor for the siege, why it is legendary, let's say, in the history of the Second World War, is also that symbolism. Not only the human losses that you referred to, which are, of course, almost unimaginable in Western world terms, but the symbolism that comes from that. And part of that importance is rooted in the history of the city. And interestingly enough, for a European city, it's not that old. The city is founded in 1703 as Peter the Great, Tsar of Russia, decided that he wanted to kind of reorientate Russia towards the West. He wanted to project naval power. Russia had never really been known for naval power. It was just purely a regional land power. But he had this vision of the Baltic and Black Seas, being a place where Russia could project its power. So he decides, in the kind of rational, absolutist thought at the time, well, I'm just going to build a city at a strategically important place where my state can project power into the northeastern part of Europe. And that spot, of course, becomes the place where St. Petersburg grows, on the banks of a river at the kind of mouth of the Baltic Sea, just between Finland and Estonia. It was nothing much before that, kind of swampy. And the river that runs through there, the big one, is called the River Neva. And that's the river that runs through St. Petersburg today. It's in a kind of interesting spot. It's on a little narrow piece of land, and I always pronounce this wrong, even though English is my mother tongue. An isthmus, a little strip of land between the Baltic Sea and a very big lake called Lake Ladoga. And so the city that then grows out of that, very nice city, nice architecture, lots of bridges. It's famous for that. The city that grows up out of that becomes then a place where Russia can build ships, it can build naval bases there, and it can have a say in the Baltic, which they, of course, do then and win a big war against Sweden in the 1700s and so on and so forth. That big naval base is on a little island right outside the city. And this is going to be important as well during World War II, during the siege. It's a naval base called Kronstadt in Russian, but Kronstadt in German.
That sounds so much better to me. I understand what you're saying
You
now.
are biased, my friend. You are biased. I made the mistake in one of our YouTube videos by saying Kronstadt because I'm more familiar with it in German. But it is in Russian, from what I've been told and what I've heard, Kronstadt. In any case, that's kind of a bit of the origin story of St. Petersburg from the beginning. But It takes on some ideological symbolism as well. In the First World War, they rename it Petrograd because St. Petersburg sounds too German. They're fighting the Germans. They don't want that. And it's the place where the Bolsheviks basically carry out their coup, I guess you could say, or second revolution in Russia in 1917 to take control of the country after the initial revolution back in February 1917 had thrown out the Tsar. So in some ways, Leningrad, as it's then known from the 1920s onward, is kind of the birthplace, if you will, of the Soviet Union, because the Bolsheviks, it's there where they storm the Winter Palace and take control of that revolution. And you can see the ideological significance that's going to have when the Germans decide they want to capture it in 1941. Fill in the blanks there, Matthias. That was my quick and dirty version of 200 and something years of St. Petersburg history to get us rolling.
Absolutely. Well, what I always say is, well, you've said everything that we need to say, but of course that doesn't stop me from saying something else.
That should be the catchphrase of the podcast. Well, you've said everything.
Exactly. But there we are. I mean, you're absolutely right, of course. Also, Peter the Great, I don't want to go into great detail because otherwise we have a 18th century podcast here.
Would be cool.
Which would be great because I'd be able to talk about my favorite king, of course, of all time, of Frederick the Great. I haven't mentioned him in many episodes, dear listeners. So same period, doesn't play a role there at all, but I just like mentioning the name, just like the Deep Dark Woods. So the whole idea, of course, is really to push Russia, which Peter sees as a backward country, very eastern, into the Western Hemisphere. So Peter actually goes to the Netherlands as well, where he learns how to build ships. So he works in a dockyard. He goes to Britain, works there as well. Then he comes back and decides this is what we need to do if we want to be a modern European power. He also comes up with the idea that he wants to cut off all people's beards, because that's another great story, because beards are something backwards. So you either had to pay a fine if you're wearing a beard, or basically people were walking around and cutting off people's beards. You can see it's a very complex story that you find here. And the embodiment of all this is, as you've already said, Jesse, is the establishment, the building of St. Petersburg, exactly where it is, because it gives you access to the Baltic Sea. It also means that you're close to what in those days, of course, was the Swedish Empire, which was very, very large. So there's a big war. You already mentioned the Nordic wars of the 18th century. We don't need to go into detail. But dear listeners, you're beginning to understand why suddenly this place becomes so very important. And when we fast forward to the Russian Revolution, you already said it, and the Germans, of course, bring Lenin back to Russia in 1917. So all the way from Switzerland, another very famous story. In the Siege of Train, again, we don't need to go into this, but it is quite an interesting story, dear listeners, if you're interested in political dimensions of wars and all these things. Fascinating what goes on there. So he arrives there, and basically, you might say it starts the Second Revolution. And of course, in the end, to cut a very long story short, the communists, the Bolsheviks, we should say, they win. So for the Bolsheviks, more than anyone else, Petrograd, as it was called in those days, is a very symbolic place. And it is interesting that when we now fast forward and you look to what happens in the interwar period, when you look at what happens in World War II, and even afterwards, there is this idea that if you control certain places within Russia at that stage, or perhaps later the Soviet Union, you can control the whole of the country. And these two places are simply Moscow and St. Petersburg. We can now talk about Bolshevik ideology and how to win a war in Bolshevik ideology. Let's not go down that route, because then it gets very complex and complicated. But Lenin's idea is that the important place is the urban space. If you control the urban space, and that is in those days St. Petersburg, Petrograd, whatever you want to call it now, later on, and of course Leningrad, and Moscow, you control the entire country. I mean, I've been to Moscow, Kursk, Stalingrad, and some other places. I've actually never made it to St. Petersburg. When you go to these places, what is really striking, dear listeners, if you haven't been to Russia, what I've found, so I went to Moscow, and then I took a train from Moscow to Stalingrad, then I took a train to Voronezh and to Kursk, so days on the train. And what's absolutely striking, you get to a place like Moscow, and it's the most modern city you've ever seen. I've never seen so many brand new Mercedes cars as I saw in Moscow. And it's ridiculously expensive. I mean, the most expensive place I've ever had a pizza margarita was actually Moscow. that's now several years ago, I paid £25 for a pizza margherita. It was absolutely mind-boggling. But you jump on the train, you jump on the car, 2 hours outside, and it's like you're in a completely different country. It's like you're in a different century. So I remember stopping at these train stations, and it felt like the 19th century. So you had no paved roads, you had wooden huts, 2 buildings normally made out of stone, and that was normally the church and the train station, and that was it. So you can understand why the Bolsheviks, why Lenin said, if we control these powerhouses of this particular country, Leningrad, Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and Moscow, you basically control the entire country, because the rest of the population, to put it bluntly, will just do as they're told or will be coerced into doing as they're told. And of course, that is their big idea. And this is again why this place is so very important. You have this debate, or the struggle, you might say, between Moscow and St. Petersburg. At that particular stage, so during the time of the revolution and even afterwards, St. Petersburg is actually the more important of the two. For the reasons you already explained, it has a specific nimbus in the Bolshevik ideology, because this is where you might say the revolution won. You already mentioned the attack, the storming of the Winter Palace. That's very, very famous. I mean, the story itself is probably less exciting because not all that much happened. It was made of it afterwards, but it's turned into a big film, into a Bolshevik film. You also have this great story, which is also turned into a famous film and that period of the cruiser Potemkin, where again there's the Bolsheviks taking over, and then you have the Bolsheviks seizing Kronstadt as well. There's a big fight because an uprising against the Bolsheviks. They basically march or advance across the frozen Baltic Sea, seize this fortress. So you can see why this is so very important in their thinking, ideology, and everything else. And of course, that also then rubs off on other nations when you start to plan an invasion of it. And that, of course, is the Germans. So now my question to you, what have I forgotten now?
We're just going to keep going in this circle. Have you forgotten something?
Exactly, round and round.
It's more of a comment than a question, you know. No, what I would just add before we jump into the World War II segment of the podcast, let's say, is that, of course, listeners, we shouldn't forget that St. Petersburg and Moscow are not only critical to the control of Russia because of their size, because of their modernity, but in the Marxist point of view, because that's where the workers are. That's where the factories are, right? So if you're going to have a revolution, or if you're going to control a revolutionary society, or if you're going to lead a revolutionary population against a fascist invader, you've got to rely on the workers, right? That's a part of the ideology. Of course, they get very flexible about that, and they include peasants a lot more than they would have thought before the revolution happens, but no matter. And of course, for a very long time, St. Petersburg was the capital of the empire, including during the First World War. The Bolsheviks then move it back to Moscow during the civil war that happens. However, I think one little clue for us as to the importance of Leningrad in the eyes of Stalin, in the eyes of the communist regime, is the Winter War against Finland in 1939-1940. This is one of the justifications, actually, for the Soviets to attack Finland, is because, well, the border is too close to our second city, our second most important city, our strategic point on the Baltic Sea, and we want to move it away. Basically, there's this traditional idea in the Russian Empire and in Russia today that security means more land. It doesn't mean treaties with your neighbors. It doesn't mean good relationships with your neighbors. It doesn't mean soft power to influence your neighbors. It means taking your neighbors. That's what security means in the Russian and Muscovite tradition. And that's one of the reasons why the Winter War happens against Finland. And they achieve part of their goal. They don't get regime change in Finland, but they get the border pushed back. And of course, all of this flows into why it's one of the three main objectives that the Germans are going for when they invade the Soviet Union in 1941.
And you talked about the workers, and of course, that's an absolutely crucial point. So in 1939, about 11% of the industrial output of the Soviet Union came from within the Leningrad region. It's also one of the reasons why the Germans, when they start planning the invasion of the Soviet Union, think that Leningrad is a very important place. So when they look at this, they say, we've got different objectives. And it's also very interesting when you look at the differences in the German high command, or between the German high command, the military high command, and Hitler. So in the original plans, they're still quite sure about what they want. So they say, well, the first one, of course, is Leningrad, is Moscow, and then we'll seize the territories in the east. When you go further into the operation, that's a different podcast. But when Hitler then decides to divert some troops from the Moscow area to have this big pocket operation around Kiev, his generals are dead against this. They said that's not important. The only thing that matters is controlling Leningrad and controlling Moscow. So in many ways, you might say the German generals are far more in line with their thinking with the Soviets themselves. And Hitler's already thinking very differently because he's thinking ahead. He's thinking about natural resources. He's thinking about grain from the Ukraine, all these things. So you can see there is a bit of a mismatch. There's a bit of a discrepancy and an argument going on. However, in the end, when they settle for the plan and they then set this plan in motion on the 22nd of June 1941, the Germans have an entire army group North, which is supposed to advance through the Baltic states and seize Leningrad. That is the task of this particular army group. And this army group is really interesting, particularly when you compare it to the other ones. So the main thrust is coming in with Army Group Center. This is the strongest one. This is where you got most of the armored formations. You then have, very briefly, you have Army Group South, which is also quite strong, but has far less armored formations. And you have a lot of the Allied force, like Romanians, going in there. So the idea is the advance is going to be very slow. The Northern Army Group is a bit of a strange one because you still have 26 divisions. I mean, that is a lot. So, Jesse, before we start this recording, we were talking about European armies at the moment. So the British Army practically has got 2 divisions at the moment. The French have got 2 divisions. The German Army on paper has got 4. So just put this into context, into perspective. This is a formidable fighting force that is marching through the Baltic states. And of course, the idea is, or the assumption is that the Germans have, that as you march through, these guys in the Baltic states will probably either support you or at least be neutral. Because the Baltic states, let's face it, have had a very, very nasty time in the 20th century. And these guys didn't want to be under Soviet rule at this particular time. And this then links into all sorts of other things that we can't get into here, like, for example, volunteers for the Waffen-SS from the Baltic states. So there's a lot of that going on as well. So they kind of bank on this. They say, okay, we've got an army group here. We're going to send it in. We're probably going to hopefully have support from the local population. And this army group is going to be able to seize Leningrad. And the big debate here really is that even at that stage is what is going to happen when you get to Leningrad? Do you want to seize it or do you not want to seize it? Because when you look at Nazi ideology and you want to gain living space in the East for German settlers, which always beggars belief, because having flown over it and being there, you always think, what did these guys want there? There's nothing there. Why would you move from somewhere like civilized Germany in the 1940s to somewhere in Russia where you don't have all that civilization and all that, and you're in the middle of nowhere? Different discussion, but quite interesting. So they said, okay, we got this. And the last thing, of course, we want is some of these Bolshevik, Slavic, subhumans, pointless eaters. Let's just get rid of them. And so there's a bit of a debate as to what is supposed to happen to Leningrad. And that, of course, then decides the fighting in the city as well. We get to that in a minute. Another point that is interesting when you look at the army group itself is the commander of this. This is the chap called Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb. He is a distinguished military commander. So he was made field marshal after the campaign against France, where he also commanded an army group, the one that doesn't see a lot of action, but still he is there. And what is interesting about him is that even though now he's spearheading this army group towards Leningrad, he'd actually made his name as an expert on defensive warfare. So in the interwar period, he writes a very influential book. And it was very influential, not least because I analyzed that to death for my PhD, which was on defensive warfare. And he writes, and it's called The Defense. And he argues that the defense, just a bit like Clausewitz in the good old days, Clausewitz has also said defense is the stronger type of warfare because you preserve your energy and then you can counterattack and things like this. And Leib writes a very influential book in which he says, this is what we need to do and this is how Germany can fight the next war, what have you. And yet in 1941, he's put in charge of this army group that is spearheading through this particular area. And even though we look at this and think, well, everything is going fundamentally well and the Germans are advancing and they reach the gates of Leningrad and everything's hunky-dory up to that stage from a German point of view, of course it isn't. Because relatively early on, things are going to go wrong for the German side as well, and the advance is being slowed down. So Jesse, what happens there?
Well, wrong, of course, is a relative term because things are going far more wrong for the Soviets at this stage than
that's true, yeah.
they are for the Germans. We shouldn't forget that. One issue that affects Army Group North is, and von Leeb says this himself, he's like, in order to really achieve my objectives, I'd probably need 35 divisions, not the 26 that I actually have. So if he'd had his way, he would have had significantly more strength to do what he's trying to do. But of course, there are a couple things that Army Group North runs into. One of them is the fact that, of course, the Germans are not this giant, modern, motorized force that the snippets of propaganda film that we often see in documentaries make us think that they are. Army Group North has 200,000 horses. That's more than all vehicles that they have combined by a very wide margin. So there's a stretch on their logistics. There's no question about that. And then, of course, the Soviets, they're not going to win any prizes for efficient defensive warfare in 1941, but they're being as effective as they can be. They are fighting hard, even if they're not fighting smart. And so this begins to wear on the Germans. There's a couple places where the Soviets try to make stands on the way to Leningrad. One is this pre-war line of fortifications called the Stalin Line, which is more famous, I think, for its positions in what is today Belarus, but it did kind of stretch up into the Baltic states as well. That eventually gets broken by the Germans, but the Soviets do fight quite hard there. They also create new forces in a way that surprises the Germans. Now, some of those units that they're creating are not very good. They recruit not only around Leningrad, but they do this around Leningrad. They create some militia divisions out of nothing, basically, called Opolchenie. And some of them only have a couple of days of quote unquote training, and I use the term extremely loosely, before they're sent right into the front. Now, this is not the way you want to fight a war, but from the Soviet point of view in 1941, that's what you can do. And so, of course, this wears on the Germans as they get farther and farther and farther from their supply bases essentially in East Prussia for Army Group North, primarily. The Soviets also make a stand around a town. And now I've been studying Russian for a long time, but it's still very tricky. So I'm going to see if I get this on the first go. Around a very small town that's fiercely defended for some time on the route to Leningrad called Krasnogvardeysk, which is the Red Guards town, if you will. A lot of towns are called that in the Soviet Union. But there you have it. They even light the forests on fire in some places in order to slow the Germans down. So these are some of the things that the Soviets are trying to do on the road to Leningrad to kind of hinder the Germans from getting there.
And as we've already said, so the German advance is not as swift and as rapid as a lot of people think, because we always think about the summer of 1941. The Germans are just slicing through the Soviet forces and just winning victory after victory until they get stopped by General Winter or whoever in the autumn and winter of 1941. It's far more difficult. And here is a prime example of this. And one of the things that is really important and that mustn't be overlooked is, of course, terrain. There is a reason why armies still today do a lot of battlefield studies, and you go to terrain and you study it, simply because looking at terrain shows you what you can do. And this part of the world, it's reasonably flat, of course, but you have a lot of woods, deep dark woods. There we are. The famous word. Finally, I managed to squeeze it in again. And of course, that means you don't have a lot of roads going through them. So that channels your advance. And the Germans have to use these roads to push down their troops. The problem on the German side is also that, as we already said, not a lot of the divisions they use are armored. Most of the armored divisions are concentrated in Army Group Center, which is spearheading towards Moscow. So these guys are actually walking. So we tend to overlook this. And you've got Tiger tanks driving from west to east and east to west and north to south. But most of these guys are actually marching into battle, just like their fathers had done in 1914 and their grandfathers had done in 1871. And you can see it in the speed of advance. So on the 22nd of June, they start advancing. And it takes them to the 28th of August till they seize the city of Tallinn, so the capital of Estonia, Reval in the old terminology. So that's a long time. That's over 2 months to capture what you might say is the Baltic states, because they are marching and because they have to divert troops. They're no longer able to concentrate all their force in the point of main effort going towards Leningrad on the operational level, yes, but not the tactical level, because they have to use all these roads. So creating the Schwerpunkt, the point of main effort, is very difficult for them. And that really, really does slow them down. And that, as you already said, gives the Soviets the time to start preparing for the defense of Leningrad. Like most of these in that particular time, it's all very rudimentary. They're not very well prepared, the Soviets. But when you look at it, what they actually do, it is still quite impressive what the Soviets managed to achieve. If I just throw some numbers at you, dear listeners, so you're looking at, roughly speaking, 300 kilometers of timber barricades that the Soviets managed to do. And you might say, timber, what does that do in a Second World War scenario? Well, it helps a lot if you are facing an infantry enemy force. It's probably no good if you have an all-tank, all mobile, all motorized enemy. But that's not the German army, particularly in this part of the world. You have about 635 kilometers of wire entanglements, 700 kilometers of anti-tank ditches. That's a lot of digging that the people
by
do.
civilians, most
by
of it.
civilians. Exactly, absolutely right. You're looking at around 5,000, roughly speaking, earth and mainly timber, so they don't have time to pour concrete or what have you, but emplacements and also some of these concrete bunkers. So that's a lot that they managed to achieve. And that, of course, slows the German advance down even further. Nevertheless, by the end of August, the Germans managed to reach, you might say, the outskirts of Leningrad. And roughly speaking, a week later, by the 8th of September, the Germans have managed to cut off the supply line. So basically, we're talking railways. This is the 1940s. Supply comes in via the railway. So if you manage to cut off railways, you basically cut off supplies. So by September, the Germans have kind of achieved that. They haven't seized the city yet. There's still a lot they need to do. But at this stage, the Germans are relatively confident that they're going to win this. They're going to seize Leningrad and they're going to occupy the city. There is the story, which unfortunately is not true, that at this stage Hitler had already invitations printed for the big victory parade and reception he was going to have in the main hotel in Leningrad. It's one of these nonsense stories, but it fits in quite nicely. It paints a nice picture. So that's not what they're thinking. But it looks as if they're winning at this particular stage. And then, of course, you've got other things happening as well. For example, you've got the Finns getting engaged. So I'm not quite sure we want to talk about the Finns now or leave them for later. What do you think?
Let's give them their due for now. I mean, they don't go that far, as it turns out. So Finland, as many of our listeners may have heard or read, I should say, they join the Germans in 1941 because they're looking to get the territory back that they lost to the Soviet Union in the Winter War of 1939-1940. So they do start to advance into a region known as Karelia and also into this isthmus towards Leningrad, towards the old Polish-Soviet border. In the meantime, though, the Soviets had, before the Second World War begins in the East, so before 1941, they had created a fortified region, the Karelia fortified region. So they have quite a lot of fortifications north of Leningrad facing the Finns. And the Finns are a little bit cautious. They don't want to go all out. They're hedging their bets, which turns out in the future to be a very, very good idea for them. But they don't want to go all out. The Germans try to convince them to do more, to bomb the city from the air, and so on and so forth. They stop on September 7th. So they move into Soviet territory. In their view, it's actually Finnish territory that they're just reclaiming. And then they kind of stop. So they do help to seal off the northern approaches to the city, but they don't really go much beyond that. What I think is interesting for us to come away with about the German drive from the south of the city is that it's a little bit, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a little bit herky-jerky, because as you approach Leningrad from the south, so you're coming towards that isthmus between the Baltic and this big lake, Lake Ladoga, and you have this narrow thing in the middle, that's where the city is. There's a series of hills several kilometers south called the Pulkovo Hills. And you can overlook a little bit of flat plains and then the city and the river Neva from those hills. And the Germans basically stopped there, immediately south of the city. But east of the city, you have the lake. And that's where they shoot ahead and reach the shores of the lake in early September. I think it's September 8th. I think you mentioned the date. And they reach a very small village there, I guess, called Schlüsselberg. And that's where they kind of, as they say, Halder, I think, says, hey, the job is done and we have closed the Iron Ring. Germans love calling things iron in wartime. I've seen all sorts of propaganda postcards.
There's nothing wrong with iron. There's nothing wrong with iron.
Iron is strong but brittle, and I'll let our listeners run with that metaphor for however they like.
German iron isn't.
Oh, yeah, I'm pretty sure history shows otherwise. But anyway, we won't get into that for the moment. We're still on our way to Leningrad here. So the Germans stop on the hills south of the city, but just east of the city, they run much further and they're able to reach the shores of the lake, which means that the city is cut off except for access over the lake. And that's going to be a key element for almost 3 years during the siege. The question for the Germans is, or the question actually that I wanted to ask you, Matthias, not all Germans, that I want to ask you, there's this, they don't cross the river, right? Because the Germans, they reach the shore of the lake, the river's right there, right next to them. If they could have crossed the Neva at that point next to the lake, they might have occupied that part of the shore of the lake, which would have really been an impenetrable, unbroken siege ring around the city. But they don't do it. The Soviets blow the bridges. And of course, this is the farthest point of the German spearhead in this area, and they're not able to get across the river. Can you take us through, Matthias, briefly? Can you take us through what does it take to cross the river on the run against an active enemy? And why did the Germans fail to do that here and really close that iron ring? Make it a steel ring.
A steel ring, that's even better, isn't that? That's even stronger, absolutely right, yeah. Well, crossing a river against a well-established opponent is one of the most difficult things you can do in warfare because you're always on the back foot. You can only really do it if you have a lot of indirect fire support, which either comes from the air, so for example, in this case, dive bombers, or a lot of artillery. One of the big German problems that you find throughout the war is that the Germans are actually quite weak on artillery. And that goes back to the doctrine of, it's the wrong word, we've talked about this before in an episode, but let's use the term anyway, blitzkrieg. The idea is if you want to refight the First World War, you need to have lots of artillery. Go back to France 1940, where the French alone have about nearly twice as many guns as the Germans have. In a war of movement, artillery is not that important because you need time to put up your guns to get them into position, to then zoom in onto the enemy's position, and then you need time to soften up the position and then to neutralize the enemy. I could now go on talking about artillery because I'm a gunner myself, so dear listeners, I don't want to bore you with the ins and outs of artillery fire, but this is what you need. So the Germans are actually quite weak on this front, in particular also the air. Yes, they've got supremacy up there at this particular stage, but again, most of the German Air Force is within Army Group Center. So they're already immediately on the back foot. If you don't have this and you want to have an opposed river crossing, it is going to cost you very, very dearly. Because the moment you put people on boats or barges or what have you, they become sitting and lame ducks for the enemy. And the next problem, of course, for the Germans is that they simply don't have this. They don't have these amphibious landing craft or even just barges or boats. They're not prepared for this particular operation. So they need to get these from somewhere. They need to find them somewhere. They just requisition stuff that they can find, fishing boats, what have you. But that is simply not enough. So that's a big problem. The next problem that you find is in the position that you already talked about. And the clue is in the word Schlüsselburg. If you take the German word of it, Schlüsselburg, which means the key. And this is really the most important position in this area here. This is why they founded that place there, because it sits in this very prominent place. That's why you have that fighting in this area. And the next problem that you find on the German side is then the development and evolvement of the whole operation. So they get there to the position that you already mentioned. The Germans then pick up some messages from within Leningrad in which the Soviets say, well, we're going to evacuate the city. All the civilians need to get out. As always, the story in Soviet warfare at that stage is you leave the civilians in for far too long. But the message gets out. It doesn't happen in the end, and we'll talk about this much more later on because that causes all these civilian casualties, but the message gets out. The Germans read this as, okay, the Soviets know they've lost, they're going to surrender quickly, and we're going to win this. So Leeb is actually given orders to launch the attack onto Leningrad and seize the city on the 5th of September. However, the attack doesn't really go very well. It doesn't really go according to plan. And also the Germans say we're now entering a huge city. The last thing that you need here is a lot of tanks, because tanks in Second World War doctrine, it's changed a little bit since then. Tanks are not seen as particularly useful because it's very easy to knock them out. So actually, his Panzer Group 4, which is the main armored formation that Leeb has at this stage, is taken away from him and it's transferred to Army Group Center, so he can take part in the attack onto Moscow. So immediately his forces have been weakened. And the combination of all of these factors mean that Leeb at this stage realized, you know what, we're not going to seize this. We can't do this, and we need to come up with a different plan. Fighting continues. Then the advance, they're trying to still advance into October, into November. But it's obvious that there's a problem here. Well, if you look at it like a problem, you say this is from a pure military point of view, because in military thinking, you want to seize the objective. For Leeb and the army group, the prize is seizing Leningrad. You've done that, and you've basically achieved what you were tasked to achieve. However, and this comes back to this whole debate about what do you do with these Soviets, these Slavs, these Untermenschen, as they would call them, these needless eaters. Do we really want them? And while all this is going on, so the attack has just started in early September, on the 29th of September, Hitler actually sends out a directive to Army Group North, which sets out his idea for the fighting in this area. And I'm going to quote, it's a relatively lengthy quote, but I think it's worth having this. And Hitler says, after the defeat of Soviet Russia, there can be no interest in the continued existence of this large urban center, i.e. Leningrad. Following the city's encirclement, which has been achieved, the Germans in the south, the Finns in the north, requests for surrender negotiations shall be denied, since the problem of relocating and feeding the population cannot and should not be solved by us. In this war for our very existence, we can have no interest in maintaining even a part of this very large urban population. So that makes very clear what Hitler wants to achieve. He basically wants to starve, to kill, to get rid of all the people living there. And that is a very, very, very stark message. And I mean, that is extremely strong. You look at what happened after the war, for example, this whole debate, was this a war crime? Was this not a war crime? There is an American tribunal which sits after 1945 looking at Nazi atrocities. They actually come to the conclusion that this was not an atrocity and not a war crime, because they argue, in accordance with the law of war at that particular time, starving civilian population was, in inverted commas, okay. Of course, our views have fundamentally changed on this. And if you ask anybody, including myself, of course, this is a war crime. I mean, dear listeners, you can't really see this now, but unusually, I'm actually wearing uniform today because I had to do some army stuff. We had to promote someone and I didn't have time to get changed. And I always think this is one of these big stains on the German uniform and the honor of the German army. I mean, the army, you might argue, and again, we might get into this a bit more, fought honorably. But when you look at this part at least, we're not talking about genocide, not talking about killing of Soviet prisoners that we've touched on before. When you just look at the frontline soldier. But the political aims they were fighting for here, absolutely awful, because you're just factoring in the demise of a huge city of, at that stage, over 1 million people. And again, we can look at the casualty figures later on. So absolutely awful.
Yeah, and I think there are different estimates as to how many Soviet people were trapped in the cutoff area. The population of the city before the war began was something like 2.8 million. A smaller number of them managed to flee before the Germans cut it off. Of course, the Soviets were disorganized. They didn't really organize a proper evacuation in any way, shape, or form. Then you have people who were refugees from the surrounding areas. Then you have all the villages and suburban areas just on the edge of the city. So it's probably, and then of course you have military who are in there. They need food as well. So it's something like 2.5 to 3.5 million people trapped in what becomes this 900-day, basically, siege of Leningrad. Now, I think that our discussion today is going to be episode 1 of our Leningrad mini-series, because now we've kind of taken you, listeners, and ourselves from the start of the city of St. Petersburg in the 18th century and its strategic importance, its symbolic importance from the revolution, to then the course of military action in 1941, where by the end of the first third of September, the Germans have indeed cut it off, with the exception of this access across the lake, which is very precarious. And you have these millions of Soviets trapped in there. They have a new commander, I should mention before we leave off for today. Zhukov is put in command of the defense of Leningrad from September 10th. He won't be there for that long, but nonetheless, it's a sign of how important it is that the Soviets want to hang on to this city. They don't want to let it go. They don't want to give it up to the Germans in any way, shape, or form, because it means something. Not only does it have this significant industry that's going to continue producing even while under siege, as we'll talk about in a future episode, but it has this symbolism to that. That's another reason why the NKVD, so the kind of Soviet political paramilitary organization, secret service, if you will, they play a prominent role. There's whole divisions of the NKVD that are involved in the fighting. One of those divisions was responsible for trying to help stop the river crossing that we talked about near Schlüsselberg, near the lake. So we have brought you up now to the closing, in quotation marks, of the Iron Ring in September 1941. Of course, the siege lasts another 2.5 to 3 years, but there's only so much work you can do in a day, as my dad used to say. So I think, Matthias, have you got any little factoid you want to jam into the end of this here before we take our leave?
Well, how couldn't I? How couldn't I? It wouldn't be me, would it? Just a very, very short one, because you talked about Zhukov, and we haven't really talked a lot about Soviet commanders. It is interesting, of course, Zhukov, he is you might say, the great hero of the Great Patriotic War, particularly towards the end. A bit different when you look at the beginning, where he had a slightly harder time. He gets sacked a number of times as well. But as you said, he's brought in. And he's brought in to relieve another Soviet commander, and he's called Popov. And that's a very interesting character as well. In very typical Soviet army style, you might say, comes from very humble backgrounds, joins the Red Army, then rises through the ranks. He is also one of the scapegoats for the Finnish-Soviet war, where things don't go particularly well. And he's also then blamed for the initial failures at Leningrad. And what is really interesting about him, so even though he's sacked here, and twice he gets the blame for it, he's not in good Soviet style executed or something else. He's pushed to one side for a while, but later on he comes back and has a bit of revival, and he remains, first of all, remains alive, which is quite interesting in that particular
achievement.
System. Exactly, but he then goes on to other things and even going into the political realm and what have you. And what's also very interesting about him is then, as all this unfolds and everything's not going well, he is summoned back to Moscow to have a briefing, or basically a telling off and telling down by Stalin, that it's all your fault. And what is interesting in that particular meeting, so they're having dinner together, and he just basically bangs his hand on the desk and he throws his plate on the table and has a massive go at Stalin, and tells Stalin that actually it's all your fault because of the purges that we had before the war. We don't have any capable generals left anymore in the Red Army. And what is really fascinating about this, when you know anything about this particular regime, is that, well, he lives another day and he's not executed, he stays. Because even Stalin realized at that stage, after the purges of the late 1930s, he can't get rid of any more generals, even unpopular ones, even those that are not performing particularly well. So I think that's a very, very interesting story as well. You can see how the dynamics within the Soviet system are changing. And if you move forward, it's got nothing to do with Leningrad now, but when you move it forward to the later stages of the war, you can actually see that Stalin gives his generals far more freedom than, for example, Hitler does in 1944, 1945. That's a different story, but I think it fits in quite nicely with the context of Soviet commanders and Soviet military doctrine and ethos.
All right. So on that note, praise for Stalin, in a manner of speaking, not something you hear that often on our or perhaps any other reasonable podcast. But nonetheless, that's it for today, folks. We will pick up with more of the story on the Siege of Leningrad in future episodes. I want to remind you all that if you are so inclined and you're able to, and you want to support the podcast, you can join our members community at bothsidesofthewire.com, and you can even try out our exclusive War Room area with extra content. This week, Matthias and I chat about childhood memories and the history books that inspired us to make a career out of history, in fact. And you can try it out for free for a trial using the code DeepDarkWoods. So hopefully we see you there. And of course, we will be with all of you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
Ta-da! Kalinka, 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 Maya.
Terrible political system. They had pretty cool music, though.
Yeah.
I have to give them that. Like, a lot of those Red Army songs are very catchy.